I'll never apologize for the United States of America. Ever. I don't care what the facts are.
Why are we going to sit down and talk to these quote-unquote moderate rebels?
Who are the truly moderate rebels?
The search for the moderate rebel. Do these moderate rebels exist?
Moderate
rebels.
You are listening to Moderate Rebels. Today we have a very interesting episode, which is kind of different from what we normally do.
Because it's not usually interesting.
Well, yeah, that's true too. But, usually we focus primarily on U.S. foreign policy, the perpetual war state, etc. We're certainly going to talk about that today, but we're also going to talk about one of the most major media outlets in the world, its history, and how it's come from a hipster Bible to a voice for U.S. imperialism. And of course, I'm speaking of Vice Media, which today is a multi-billion-dollar media company. Its CEO and co-founder Shane Smith, who is now a billionaire, claims that Vice is worth as much as the New York Times, and his goal is to be as big as CNN. We're going to talk about how this, hipster, anarchisty punk magazine that was very nihilistic went from printing violent pornography in the late 90s to 20 years later, not only being an empire in its own right, but also creating propaganda on behalf of the U.S. empire.
Don't say violent pornography, because you sound like a Christian pastor.
I mean, that's really what they were doing. And they really used to publish violent pornography. I mean, not just pornography in the sexual sense, which was certainly true, but also they had lots of photos of people vomiting and defecating and peeing. I mean, and tons of violence and blood. That sums up Vice's early aesthetic.
Yeah, but don't say violent pornography, because you sound like a pastor.
Okay, well, this is going to be part one in a special double episode, both dissecting and analyzing Vice and how it's become a mouthpiece for U.S. foreign policy and wars abroad. In this first episode, we'll talk more about the history of Vice. We'll talk about its style, aesthetic, its changed editorial policy. We'll talk about the motley cast of characters behind it, from the founders to the coterie of regime change trolls who slithered out of Vice. And then, of course, we'll also talk about the massive corporate investment in Vice. Vice has seen billions of dollars of investment from large media corporations, including some of the biggest media corporations in the world, like 21st Century Fox, Disney, A&E Networks, and more. And then in the second episode, in the follow-up, we will analyze specifically some of the propaganda Vice has created, looking at a documentary film it made that trumpets the U.S. empire, and looking at its coverage of Venezuela and how Vice has whitewashed neo-Nazis in Ukraine and beyond. But like I said, in part one, in this first episode, we're going to explore how Vice went from this, nihilistic punk magazine and 20 years later has become not only a media empire, but a voice for the U.S. empire. And today we have one of the biggest Vice experts, if you will. I don't know, maybe you can put that in your CV, but we have Robbie Martin with us. Robbie is also a journalist, does great investigative work, and a filmmaker. He has an excellent film investigation of neoconservatives and the same kind of imperialist foreign policy we'll be talking about. And he's a co-host of Media Roots Radio.
With Abby Martin,
another great journalist and friend of the show. And he's based in Oakland. So thanks for joining us, Robbie.
Thanks for having me, guys.
I blurbed your documentary, A Very Heavy Agenda, because I was just blown away, not only by the quality of it, but by how many different dimensions you uncovered in our understanding of neoconservatism and how it's sort of worked its way into popular culture. And you cover Vice in this documentary. I mean, this is like a 4 or 5 part documentary. And I mean, how many parts and how many hours long is it?
Well, the original one was a trilogy, and it was 7.5 hours long. But I'm working on episode 4.
But that wasn't long enough.
Of it. It's probably not going to turn into a second trilogy, but I'm going to see how far I can get with it. But episode 4 is primarily focusing on basically Trump's first year in office and how the neocons are eventually coming back around to him after they played this game of hating him and trying to distance themselves from him for over a year.
Yeah, I think that's one of the key stories and pieces that hasn't been written or put on film, which is how the neocons rolled Trump and worked their way back into the national security state architecture, while Bill Crystal was kind of pretending to be this never Trumper on the outside and attracting all the attention. The neocons were taking over the State Department, reasserting their control over the National Security Council, etc. But again, I think one of the most important parts of your kind of psychedelic trip through the bowels of the neoconservative hell is how they've impacted our popular culture. And Vice plays a key, if not completely central role in giving the neocons access to a generation of young people. I think one of the things you said that really rang true for me was that, Vice has not only become kind of a vehicle for American regime propaganda, it's normalized it. And it's done that because it has the trust of not just the millennial generation, but, my generation, Generation X, because I wasn't a fan of Vice, but I remember reading Vice, around, in the early 2000s and seeing it as kind of an alternative magazine that had an edgy aesthetic. Over a decade later, I found myself in Vice's headquarters in Brooklyn, and it's like this sweatshop factory of 20-something ambitious hipsters. The guys all like have all the different hipster looks. Like there's the lumbersexual guy.
That's the second lumbersexual joke you've made on the show, Max.
Then there's the guy, the kind of nerd hipster artist with the like flat visor, sideways cap, and you get all the different looks. And then, I met with someone in a high level editorial position, and I'm thinking, this guy is so corporate. What is he doing here? And his background was, NBC and all of the corporate networks. And it's just this vast warehouse that has basically weaponized the hipster aesthetic to push the most mainstream narrative possible, which is of the kind of bipartisan foreign policy consensus. So I wonder, just given that trajectory, if we can, go back and just start with your research on Vice and explain for us its origins and how maybe those origins actually foretold this mainstream trajectory.
Well, yeah, it's a bit complicated, but I'll try to unpack it as best as I can. Originally, when I read Vice, I felt the same way. It seemed like a counterculture magazine. It was trying to be very edgy, even, in some ways kind of rapey. And, the phrase toxic masculinity comes to mind. It's not a phrase that I
definitely
like to use very often, but I think Vice, especially from their early era, very much fits that bill. It was sort of under the guise of being incredibly sex positive, almost in some ways like third wave feminism, but that stuff. In certain ways, especially the way Vice was presenting it, using the word fag very frivolously, very frequently in their magazine, retard, a lot of words like that were used in their magazine, trying to be very edgy, and it turns out that a lot of that stuff, a lot of that kind of content, comes directly from one of their co-founders, Gavin McInnes, who, if people out listening haven't heard of Gavin McInnes, I would argue that he is potentially one of the most influential figures in the alt-right, even though he isn't, put to the same level as people like Mike Cernovich or Jack Posobiec in terms of their popularity. I think Gavin McInnes is much more of an influencer, and he also had a lot of influence on just popular culture in the United States, sort of edge culture, because of his strong influence and role in Vice magazine. He was their lead editor. Even by the other founders' admissions, Gavin McInnes was the vision of the entire magazine up until 2006. So Shane Smith was mostly just the marketing guy. That was his expertise, and fashion. But Gavin McInnes was sort of the content guy at Vice. And that thread, sort of that toxic masculinity, red-pilled hipster vibe of Vice, you can see that thread almost throughout the entire magazine, and even beyond the point when Gavin McInnes left. So that sort of imprint on it kind of lasted, even beyond his tenure there.
He established the aesthetic, is what you're
absolutely
saying.
And Ben mentioned earlier that Terry Richardson was also one of their main photographers there, and that was also another Gavin McInnes hire. He had a relationship with Terry Richardson, and Terry Richardson has been accused of sexual assault and even rape since that. But that's the thing. Terry Richardson became such a popular, hot photographer that he even photographed Obama and things like that. So, there was a lot of sort of things coalescing where, popular culture and Vice was really hitting on this zeitgeist for a while. And that's when, after Gavin McInnes left, and there's kind of argument as to why he left. It's probably, because of his politics, that he was getting too right-wing, drifting even more, conservative, that they had to let him go. But they basically signed a non-disparage, non-disclosure agreement on both sides where you'll notice that neither camp talks about each other. So Gavin McInnes never mentions Vice anymore, and subsequently Vice never mentions him anymore. And actually, oddly, they go out of their way often to not mention him. So, for example, when the New York Times did this explosive sort of sexual harassment expose about Vice, came out a few months ago, Gavin McInnes is mentioned several times in the article, but not by name. And Vice actually responds at one point to the author of the article, talking about Gavin McInnes, but again, not mentioning him by name. So there's some strange, there were some legal documents obviously signed that make it very difficult for them to talk about each other, which is sort of interesting to watch when you're trying to sort of unpack this, this potential drama that happened when they had a falling out.
At this point, he's an open white supremacist. He calls himself a Western chauvinist. He has a gang of white hipsters who, are openly racist.
The Proud Boys.
The Proud Boys.
That's like the dumbest name for a Nazi hipster group I've ever. But he's kind of like the alt-light. I mean, he's helping mainstream the alt-right.
Yeah. He's one of the types who tries to distance himself from the open fascists, but he definitely has very far-right racist views. He's openly misogynist.
Since you just brought that up, though, I mean, he was photographed with Chelsea Manning at this New York bash, and he had just been on stage referring to trans people as...
Yeah, he said gender N-words. He said that multiple times.
So, I mean, it's not like he's sort of dog whistling racism. I mean, this guy's an out-and-out white supremacist.
Yeah, his rebranding, I think, was after Charlottesville. It was kind of like a lot of those alt-right borderline people kind of panicked, and they needed to quickly figure out a way to rebrand away from being blatant anti-Semites and racists. But it's, as you said, yeah, he keeps saying things that show that he's not really moving away from that. He's just doing it sort of as a strategy.
While we're on this subject of Vice's early days, I think it's really interesting to look at how this magazine, which was founded in Montreal and Quebec in 1994, in the span of just 2 decades has become this media empire, which, as I said earlier, is also a voice for U.S. empire. We'll get back to that later as well. But I think pulling this thread is really interesting and important to understand like how it got here. And I was actually picking the brain of some folks in New York who have been involved in alternative media for many years. And I was speaking with the journalist Jed Brandt, who is involved in the early days of New York indie media and who's been closely following Vice since its earliest days. And he pointed me to this book published in 2007 called The Vice Photo Book. And if you look, I mean, it's this big photo book. It just shows how much Vice has rebranded. I mean, in the early days, in the late 90s and even the early 2000s, I used the term earlier of violent pornography, and Max kind of joked that makes me sound like a Christian. But no, this really, like, I'm certainly not a prude. Like, it actually is violent pornography. I mean, you look at some of the covers, you look at some of the photos they used inside the magazine. I mean, it's extreme exploitation culture. We're in extreme violence. We're talking about people pooping. There's a photo of a guy peeing in his own mouth. There's photos of child prostitutes who are like sexually posing. There's tons of photos of guys puking. There's so many drugs, and it's this kind of like it's taking excrement and turning it into like glorifying it. It's the glorification of excrement. I mean, that's what Vice's aesthetic was. Jed Brandt, when I was talking to him, he described it as a hip Howard Stern, and I think that's actually a good way to describe it, because the point he was making is that in the late 90s and early 2000s, what's happening inside alternative media is you have the collapse of these kind of major alt weeklies. So you have the Village Voice in New York City, you have the Bay Guardian in San Francisco. Those magazines, which had previously been incredibly important culturally and politically, are kind of dying out. You also have the rise of indie media. So you have the Independent in New York, you have alternative media and indie media on the internet. And then Vice comes out as this kind of apolitical, punk, right-leaning, absurdist magazine. And it injects itself in that. And it's very apolitical. I think that's a very important point. I know, maybe this sounds a little off track, but I actually think it's incredibly important because that kind of aesthetic can lead us straight to today, where you have massive corporations, media conglomerates, private equity firms just injecting hundreds of millions of dollars into this company because that aesthetic was never really threatening. That right-leaning, contrarian, nihilist aesthetic, it is not dissentious. It doesn't challenge power. It's just contrarian. You have leftist magazines and publications that are threatening, even if they don't have the same edgy aesthetic, but because they're actually challenging power and where power resides. Large corporations are not going to invest billions of dollars in communist publications. That just doesn't happen. But because Vice in the early days was never really super political, I think that's one of the main reasons we've got to the point where we are today, and we have to trace that thread to understand where it came from.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. I mean, there wasn't really a political bent to Vice except for
just contrarianism for the sake of contrarianism.
I think you mentioned it. It actually had a little bit of a right-leaning vibe to it, almost. And that's, and I think that's because of Gavin's involvement. And even though a lot of these things like drug use, sexual liberation, polyamory, a lot of these things that Vice championed are associated with liberalism and maybe more the people on the left side of the spectrum, the actual thread going through it was sort of a right-leaning, kind of misogynist, and even in some ways homophobic kind of undercurrent to it. So, yeah, I think that's very important. And also, I mean, if you just think about all those things, drugs, sex positivity, even just straight pornography, all of those things sort of give you the impression that what you're reading, isn't trying to propagandize you. It sort of lets your guard down. And I think that, I'm not saying that Vice from its very inception was strategically trying to get people to let their guard down to, shove foreign policy propaganda down their throat. But that's essentially what it is now. And I feel like that is why corporate investors and even, the Obama administration and people in the U.S. government saw value in Vice because millennials and hipsters trust it. Because it speaks to them about drugs. And, there was even a thing on Viceland the other day where it was like, for the first time ever, we're showing you from the beginning to end the MDMA production in a lab, and it shows like the host of the show like with a mask on in a lab, like watching them make MDMA. So it's like you wouldn't think that a show or a company filming an illicit drug lab making MDMA and spinning it positively would also be trying to shove down anti-Russian propaganda down your throat, but that is literally what they're doing. And I think that both of those components are very important together, because without all that stuff, without all that hip sex and drug stuff, I don't think people would trust it nearly as much as they do and sort of just accept what they're hearing in terms of like the foreign policy, geopolitical side of Vice.
Yeah, it's like I can do Molly and mushrooms and hippie flip and still have my regime change and project U.S. power and enforce the rules-based international order. Like what's wrong with that?
Exactly.
It's like they're not trying to take away my, they're not trying to get in my bedroom with Rick Santorum. This is cool. We should free the people of Ukraine from Russian domination anyway. Let them hippie flip in Maidan with the Pravdi sector, the right sector.
When you mentioned that, it actually just brought to mind Dan Savage, because I was just trying to think of someone else who's injected foreign policy propaganda who was kind of in a similar position, but that's a total aside. But
it's an aside, but I mean, it just reminded me of how awful he's gotten, and he's used a completely different method for kind of insidiously slipping in the kind of regime change narrative into completely liberal cultural sensibility. But I think we should, just move forward and kind of talk about the transition. What do you think the transition point for Vice was? I mean, we know that Vice hired as its chief of staff for operations a former Obama staffer who, was accompanying Obama on Air Force One, Alyssa Mastromonaco, and that a month after she came in and was spiking stories favorable to Bernie Sanders, Joseph Biden came.
Oh, I think it was actually for Hillary Clinton. Wasn't that what the...
No, she was killing stories favorable to Sanders.
Yeah.
She was killing stories favorable to Sanders, but a month after Mastromonaco enters Vice, Shane Smith shows up before the Vice hipster sweatshop in Brooklyn with Joseph Biden, and this is in 2015. But I mean, even before that, 2013, Rupert Murdoch is the head of 21st Century Fox, the right-wing media mogul, buys a 5% stake in Vice. His son joins the board of Vice soon after. I mean, this is a $70 million buy. So all of these, there's all these investments in Vice from corporate media and corporate right-wing media. I mean, Murdoch heads Fox News.
This point is really important because you mentioned that Rupert Murdoch's son, James Murdoch, joined the board of Vice, and he became a director as part of the agreement. So 21st Century Fox invested $70 million into this company, and as part of the agreement, Murdoch, who had recently gone through a scandal in the UK over phone hacking, he put his son in as a director.
What do you think, I mean, just from your point of view, how did Vice transition into this kind of full-blown megaphone for the American national security state?
Well, and part of this is going to be speculative on my part, but I feel like the Obama administration coming into office was the beginning of their transition. Gavin McInnes already left over a year earlier, and this is not to give a points to Gavin McInnes because it's not for the right reasons, but I believe that Gavin McInnes was not an Obama supporter, and that definitely created some friction. And I believe that as horrible as Gavin McInnes is, I think that he would have probably had a problem with Vice being so on board with sort of the Obama administration's foreign policy just from a political ideology perspective. So after he left, I think is really when they started to transition. As early as, and it's actually, if you look at a lot of their early stuff after the Obama administration got in, it started to shift in terms of their level of seriousness. Now and I think Vice News, the HBO show, was that big shift, which if you're unfamiliar with the show, people listening are unfamiliar with it. Basically, it was kind of like a hyper real, kind of shaky cam, very intense, uncensored news show, which went to all these sort of world, countries around the world. I think there was actually one episode where Shane Smith went to Liberia and, was showing how horrible the conditions were. A lot of the first Vice News specials were just Shane Smith himself, the head of Vice, going around to all these third world or different, hotspots around the world, and just showing how horrible the conditions were. And I've described it before as almost like hipster exploitation tourism, adventure tourism, where, there was a film series put out in the early 70s called Mondo Connie, which was shown in Grindhouse double features at cinemas, which was kind of, showing you African, manhood rituals,
post-colonial Africa exploitation, antebellum slavery exploitation, and it was kind of, it's these Italian 1970s films with kind of Italian funk music, and they make, it clearly appeals to a kind of racist pathway in white people's brains, but at the same time, it's mocking white middle class culture.
Yeah, and I feel like Vice Vice News, the show, even though it was done with a serious tone and it wasn't done as a mocky or sort of an over the top style, I believe it sort of fits the same mold as that Mondo Connie movie series did. It's just a modern version of it. And that's sort of how I saw it, which is problematic in and of itself, because like you said, it does sort of open up those racist pathways in your brain. That was sort of my sense of it when it first started. But then I realized rather quickly that it was actually co-funded by Bill Maher of real-time Bill Maher, one of the most famous Islamophobes who claims to be a liberal who still has a platform. And then I started noticing that Fareed Zakaria was a consultant on pretty much every episode. And very quickly after I realized that, I started noticing that as early as 2011, Vice was very much championing the death of Gaddafi, for example. So in 2011, Vice News official tweeted out on October 2011, "Today, Gaddafi is spelled D-E-A-D. We imagine our buddies, the rebels of Libya, are celebrating pretty hard right now." And Shane Smith is there like chilling, with sunglasses on next to a bunch of the rebels.
It's not even like a funny or edgy tweet. It's like, that's not even funny.
No.
It's just so overt.
In that tweet, they linked to the full-length documentary they made, which is just blatant propaganda in support of those rebels, many of whom were dominated by Al-Qaeda. Like, this is well documented now.
But the rebels ride motorcycles or something, so it kind of fits their aesthetic again. They did the same damn thing in East Aleppo. They rode around with, they did a profile on the rebels' motorcycle gangs and the music they listen to.
Yeah.
And, probably the Captagon they take. But, we're talking about Al-Qaeda and company here.
Well, in part 2 of this episode, we go into detail dissecting Vice's propaganda on Syria, which is very similar. But in this Libya documentary, there's, of course, no mentioning of the fact that these rebels, Al-Qaeda-linked rebels, ethnically cleansed black Libyans. They destroyed the entire communities of black Libyans, and they enslaved them. And, of course, we've seen reports in the past several months, all these people freaking out, rightfully, that there are open-air slave markets where African refugees are being sold, but there's no acknowledgement of the fact that these same rebels that were glorified by Vice and every other mainstream media outlet that were backed by NATO are the people enslaving those African refugees.
Yeah, it's quite remarkable. It's actually far more obvious, I think, when you go back to this era of Vice. Looking at it, especially from the perspective of right now, it's blatantly obvious what foreign policy propaganda they were digesting from who knows where and putting it back out to their audience. And there definitely was even a shift away from that, the more obviousness of it. And I feel like that shift came when sort of the Cold War 2.0 shift happened, in terms of when the Sochi Olympics happen is when the sort of what I would argue is the major shift into being a blatant tool of the U.S. State Department and the White House came into effect. I'm not. It's hard to say exactly how plugged in they were back in 2011, but I think it becomes much more clear when you get up into 2014, 2015, especially with the transfer of Alyssa Mastromonaco from the White House to Vice. And sort of the things that happened after that. But even before that happened, if she made this transition so easily, and this is speculation on my part, but I think there's enough evidence to suggest this, that there was already White House coordination going on with Vice, that perhaps went actually beyond, a typical U.S. government kind of minder effect on another media organization like CNN. And I, my perspective on this is that I believe the Obama administration was incredibly skilled and very savvy about plugging into hipster media in general. We tend to forget that Obama went on the WTF podcast with Mark Maron. He went on Between Two Ferns. He was going on all these different shows, seemingly, that other presidents or other administrations hadn't, plugged into before. They weren't, in my opinion, savvy enough to sort of plug into that sort of millennial sort of cultural zeitgeist like Obama did.
I mean, that was his whole 2008 campaign was just that. And, having Arcade Fire open at your mega rallies in Portland, that foreshadowed the whole thing.
Yeah, and I think what we're talking about is really the second Obama administration. That's the moment. I mean, clearly we see this in the vestigial phases in the first Obama administration, but by the second, and especially when you have the intensification of the war in Syria, the intensification of the war in East Ukraine, that is the moment where Vice really just falls completely in line with foreign policy orthodoxy. And it's also no coincidence, the same time where there is massive, massive investment from large corporations. And I mean, I think we should really address this really briefly here for a second. So we talked about how Murdoch and 21st Century Fox invested $70 million in 2013. But that's just chump change compared to what came later. So in 2013, you mentioned the HBO show that began. So this is, the beginning of the second Obama administration. And then HBO renewed it in 2014. And then in 2015, HBO and Vice created a major deal. And now Vice has a significant show on HBO. But it wasn't just HBO. I mean, the amount of money we're talking about is insane here, because also in 2014, the TV giant A&E Networks, which owns tons of different TV channels, A&E Networks, along with a venture capital firm, which is called Technology Crossover Ventures, together they invested $500 million in Vice. That's in 2014. And today, A&E Networks owns 15% of Vice. And for context for listeners, A&E Networks is half owned by the Hearst Corporation, which is another corporate media conglomerate, and it's also half owned by the Disney ABC television group. So we're talking about some of the biggest names in media in this time, in the second Obama administration, are investing hundreds of millions of dollars.
Who also have investments in the national security infrastructure.
Of course. And then finally, the most extreme example is in November 2015, when Walt Disney invests $200 million in Vice. And then in the next month, another $200 million. So in the span of 2 months in late 2015, Disney invested $400 million in Vice and owns 10% of the company. So at this point, we're talking about a mainstream corporation. Vice is no longer in any way alternative. It is more than 1/4 owned by some of the biggest media conglomerates in the world. And it's no coincidence that you see people like Alyssa Mastromonaco and others, and you can talk more about that, Robbie, coalesce at the same time. I think there's a clear evolving door here, and it really shows the relationship between corporate media and the state when it comes to issues of foreign policy.
And Shane Smith is a billionaire.
Yeah.
I mean, the head of Vice is a billionaire. He's got a 20% stake. When you have a billionaire running a network, how subversive is it going to be?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good point, and it's and if it was that alone, I suppose that they could still put out good content, but there's just so many other factors here, as you mentioned, that make it very, very problematic. I mean, just the move of Alyssa Mastromonaco alone, I think, is extremely crucial here, because just in terms of media critique, what people, when people went after, for example, Fox News for hiring Dana Perino, who was the press secretary of the Bush administration. After she left, they immediately hired her. There was a lot of criticism of that. Similarly, when Tony Snow went from Fox News commentator to Bush press secretary. So I remember those were huge scandals when that happened, because at the time, I guess the world was a little more simple. It was easier to point at an outlet like Fox News as running blatant Bush administration propaganda. So that was more clear cut to people who were into media critique at the time as something to be alarmed by and to point out. But I feel like this almost got zero press, especially among the same crowd of people who were critiquing, Fox News for doing something almost exactly the same as this. But I would argue that the Alyssa Mastromonaco move is actually more troubling than a press secretary going from a Bush administration to Fox News, because she was actually had the president's ear on a regular basis, and she's constantly around him in Air Force One, in the Oval Office. And then she moves not just to being a pundit at Vice, she is their COO. So I mean, as far as that goes, I think that is like that's one of the most blatant things that I've ever seen in terms of the Obama administration trying to have an influence over a media outlet like that.
Just for context for listeners, Alyssa Mastromonaco, we mentioned her a few times. She was White House Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations under Obama, and that was from 2011 to 2014. This is a very high-level official. And then before that, she was the Director of Scheduling when Obama was in the Senate. So we're talking about one of the most senior Obama administration officials who then becomes COO Vice.
And she has a major stake in managing Obama's legacy, in making sure that Obama's legacy is secure. So, I mean, this is someone who's been with Obama since the Senate.
Yeah, and then in 2016, we're seeing the revolving door again. Mastromonaco became president of global communications strategy and talent at A&E Networks. And as I mentioned, A&E Networks has invested hundreds of millions of dollars in Vice and owns 15% of the company.
Yeah, it's quite remarkable. I mean, it's just so blatant, and Daniel Vachart has done an incredible job. If anyone hasn't been to his website, notvice.com yet, I highly recommend going there, because his new article essentially lays out a very convincing, compelling timeline about when Alyssa Mastromonaco left the White House to come to Vice, and the subsequent things that happened at Vice that, to me, imply a direct White House coordination, that in some way or another, she actually still not just had a line into the White House, but she was almost, acting as an emissary to the White House. And 80 days after she got hired at Vice, Vice President Joe Biden came to visit the Vice headquarters, as you already mentioned. And there were actually people at Vice at the time who found that very problematic. But of course, you're not going to see any commentary like that coming from Vice employees, because most of the time, if you look at most of their political content, almost none of it is editorial political content from the way that we traditionally understand it. They never have, political commentators on their network or on their website. It's always sort of these dry foreign policy, writings. And I think that that's also an important part of it, because Vice has traditionally always said, this is something that Shane Smith likes to say all the time, is that we're not journalists. Nobody at Vice is a journalist. And this is something that they used to regularly say. They don't say it so much anymore, because I think they're trying to sort of mainstreamify and sort of become part of the typical journalism world. But I think that that's something that was actually really important to them. They like to think of themselves as just sort of these young kids who, didn't really have a stake in journalism. They weren't that political. They were apolitical in some instances, and they took pride in that. But I think that also, is sort of a prime environment for injecting propaganda. When people are apolitical, when they're naive, when they're young. This was essentially the early Cold War model of Cold War TV news media. There's a great book by this author, Nancy Bernhard, who wrote a book in the 90s about television Cold War propaganda in the 1950s and onward. And she lays out, her theory basically is that the U.S. government managed to groom and produce hundreds of new sort of loyal young media professionals to help them carry the message of the Cold War at the time. And if you look at all this and you kind of zoom out from it, it kind of appears that Vice fits this mold and this model better than any other outlet does, of sort of repeating this same strategic trope from the Cold War and the way that the military used to interface with the media back then. So I find that very fascinating, that's kind of, in a way, sort of, I believe that this is how Vice is able to sort of pass that threshold where, if they did have people on their network all the time who were very political and outspoken politically, I don't believe that it would be as effective as it is basically what I'm saying.
Yeah, I think another book we can look to here is Joel Whitney's book, which came out last year, called Finks, which is about how the Paris Review and various other publications were basically instrumentalized, if not created, by the CIA to penetrate European and Western cultural spheres to advance a kind of Cold War ideology under the guise of liberal intellectual material. And a lot of the writers who were actually involved in this operation didn't even know that the CIA was behind it. In many ways, they they developed, their ideology was sort of cultivated unwittingly, this anti-communist ideology. And I was going to bring this up later, but if you actually, we've been talking about people at the managerial positions at Vice, but if you actually look at who's produced the content, this crowd that Ben and I have run up against as we've kind of turned against regime change in Syria and the proxy war there, was basically gestated within the bowels of Vice, the kind of Syria regime change trolls who are 20 and 30 somethings. One character, we can talk about is Oz Kaderji, who was basically writing, laddie mag fluff for Vice before he became this hardcore enforcer of the regime change narrative and basically behaving like Nick Cohen with a massive head injury. Molly Crabapple, the kind of celebrity left artist and Ralph Steadman plagiarist who has been like a massive figure in the Syria regime change world, was smuggled into Syria, and while she was painting cat pictures for a refugee center, which appears to be some kind of USAID front, the Karam Foundation, which has been lobbying for regime change in Washington.
Yeah, Molly Crabapple is another great example of this radical pro-regime change crowd. There's so many things we could address, like her friendship with this neo-Nazi weave, but even beyond that, Molly Crabapple wrote an article in The Guardian viciously attacking the so-called Western left. This Vice regime change crowd hates the left. All they do is just attack the left, the evil Western left. And in this article in The Guardian, Molly Crabapple cited the fake name of a Syrian American, Amal Hanano, and implied that this person had just come from Syria and was doing a protest outside the White House, reading the names of Syrians who had been killed. Well, actually, Amal Hanano is a pseudonym that was used for years to write dozens of articles in mainstream media by a Syrian American who left Syria in 1998 and lives in Illinois. And her name is Lina Sergi Attar. Lina Sergi Attar is also the CEO of the Karam Foundation, which is leading the charge and lobbying for regime change and has been for years, openly calling for the U.S. government to overthrow the Syrian government. Lina Sergi Attar studied at Rhode Island School of Design and MIT. She hasn't lived in Syria in 20 years. But Molly Crabapple and this regime change crew held up the fake name Amal Hanano as this Syrian voice in order to silence the Syrians who are still in the country and who oppose regime change, who oppose the U.S. government overthrowing their state and destroying their country. And Molly Crabapple made dozens of drawings for this fake person, Amal Hanano, for Lina Sergi Attar, in order to call publicly for U.S.-led regime change to overthrow the Syrian government while attacking the left in the largest British newspaper. And, this is just a great example of the kinds of levels of duplicity that all of these people have engaged in for a long time. And of course, they're rewarded for it. They're allowed to write articles in The Guardian attacking the Western left.
Yeah, there's so much journalistic malpractice there that we can talk about. But the point is, if you look at these characters, all of whom were involved in the doxing of Taryn Fivik, who was at the time working with the UN, doing aid work in Iraq, and lost her job because these figures doxed her because, she was under a pseudonym violating the, regime change narrative on Twitter. They've been just the most vicious group trying to enforce this narrative. Almost all of them came through Vice.
You didn't even mention Danny Gold. Danny Gold is also a key figure. This is another former Vice host who has viciously attacked any journalist who challenges the U.S. State Department narrative in Syria. He just openly calls for regime change. It's just so blatant.
And so, that fits perfectly, Robbie, within what you were saying about a group of young people who are sort of radicalized into the ideology of the American national security state, almost without knowing it, while thinking that they're doing something politically transgressive.
Absolutely. Yeah, I completely agree with what you just said. People at Vice who worked there, especially after Alyssa Mastromonaco came into the picture, I'm goddamn sure there were people there who found it very, very troubling and frankly suspicious as to what was going on.
Yeah.
Because after you had Vice President Joe Biden visit Vice to talk about how dangerous Russian media was. He was basically talking about RT, if you watch his interview. A few months after that, Obama gets an exclusive interview from Shane Smith. And that might not seem, Obama getting an exclusive interview and Biden getting an exclusive interview, that might not seem like a huge deal because Obama has been on CNN and granted exclusive interviews to other media networks. But Joe Biden visiting the Vice headquarters in and of itself, I do think is very notable because he didn't just go there to be interviewed. He went there and kind of, walked around to all the employees, shook hands with them, kind of hung out. It wasn't just a normal interview type setup.
It was like a campaign stop. It was like he was on the stump and he's projecting this friendly, cuddly image of someone who you can talk to and have access to. And for a lot of young journalists, that's very appealing, I think.
It is, yeah. And I think it was a huge, it was kind of like a huge advertisement for Vice as well. And that was my initial feeling when I saw it. Well, this is an advertisement for Vice, sort of on behalf of the White House. Now, it really came into focus, though, for me when on September 20th, 2015, there was actually a really historically important thing that Obama did where he visited a U.S. prison and spoke to prisoners. But that wasn't what was so fascinating about it to me. It was that Obama gave Vice an exclusive to come and accompany him to this visit. So, the Obama administration knew that this was a historically important moment, and they specifically chose Shane Smith and Vice to be their only media presence there at this prison. That in and of itself is very, very interesting because why would Obama choose Vice? What would be the purpose of that? Why wouldn't he invite the rest of the media to come to this historically important event? And again, it appears to just be a very sort of generous advertisement for Vice, injecting them with this legitimacy that they really never had before. They had been sort of building to this moment, but that's a huge boon for them to get an exclusive, at this level. And it wasn't something that they tried to get on their own. It was something the Obama administration handed directly to them. And most people reacted to that special as it was a positive and good thing, that it was, it was conversations that needed to be had about the prison system. Obama's really, getting on the level with the prisoners and talking to them about their conditions and things like this. But again, the critique was completely absent at the time. And I found that very strange that nobody was like, wait a second, hey, what is exactly going on here? And why is Vice basically shadowing Obama? And why did Obama even choose Vice in the first place? Those questions didn't seem to be asked. And I think they still need to be asked. As innocuous or as positive as that special may have seemed to people.
Well, on that note, we're going to have to end the first part of our double Vice feature here. We hope you enjoyed this first part. Please definitely check out the next episode. We have a lot of great reporting and interesting commentary on a propaganda documentary created by Vice called A World in Disarray, which is just a manifesto for U.S. imperialism. It features an array of neoconservative politicians, neoliberal war hawks. We also discuss Vice's propaganda on Venezuela, and we discuss how Vice has whitewashed neo-Nazis in Ukraine, who just so happen to be backed by the U.S. We have a great second part with Robbie Martin coming up. You'll be able to find the second episode, just like the first episode, on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Patreon. Our Patreon account can be found at patreon.com/Moderate Rebels. If you'd like to support the show, you can become a patron there. You'll also have access to some exclusive content, and we are on social media. We're on Twitter at Moderate Radio. As always, our show notes for this episode can be found at moderaterebelsradio.com. That's our website. The second part of this episode will be out soon. Thanks for listening.